Attention every police officer in Australia, state and federal. Please listen to the following information reporting the most serious crimes ever committed in Australian history. This may be the most important witness statement that you ever receive, so please consider the contents very carefully. The health, safety and liberty of every man, woman and child in Australia depends on the actions that you take in respect of the alleged crimes. We have witnessed what we believe to be criminal actions by many people in positions of power, which have caused death and injury to Australian men, women and children by coercing them to take experimental injections without their fully informed and legally valid consent. They did this by approving, promoting and injecting these dangerous products into millions of trusting Australians, in many cases by force, through coercion or enforcement of unlawful mandates that threatened people's livelihoods and participation in society. The perpetrators of the alleged crimes are numerous men and women who had a duty to protect the Australian people. But since 2020, instead of protecting the people, their actions and many serious departures from reasonable standards of conduct and care induced millions of Australians to take considerable risks to their health and lives. We allege that the perpetrators used their collective authority, trusted reputations, power and coercive actions to achieve their clearly promoted objective, which was to inject almost all Australians with experimental and unproven medical products that were provisionally approved and mislabelled as vaccines. Significant evidence shows that these actions have caused death and injury to potentially millions of Australians, including young healthy adults and children, many of whom simply died suddenly with no apparent explanation. Those involved in approving, promoting, mandating and injecting the experimental products include politicians, government regulators and advisors, public servants and officers, representatives of various medical bodies and other Australian institutions, doctors, pharmacists, nurses and scientists, business and union leaders, company officers and members of the media. Mainstream media has been largely silent on these alleged crimes to date. Although reports of ambulance ramping, sudden deaths and surges in diseases are reported on a regular basis, there is rarely any reference or inquiry as to what the cause may be. However, the Courier Mail reported in June 2024 that COVID-19 vaccines have been linked to an increase in worldwide deaths, according to a new study. According to the study published in British medical journal Public Health, the trend raised serious concerns as they urged government leaders and policymakers to thoroughly investigate the underlying cause of persistent excess mortality. But this and numerous other calls for inquiries and investigations into excess deaths and the risks and impacts of the COVID-19 vaccines have been ignored. It is clear that our health regulators and leaders in government and major institutions are not going to investigate themselves or voluntarily admit to any part that they may have played in committing the alleged crimes. We therefore ask the Australian Police, if you will not protect the people of Australia by investigating these alleged crimes without fear or favour, then who will? To whom should the people of Australia turn for protection of our lives and liberty, if not the Australian Police? We call on Australian police detectives to investigate the alleged crimes and pursue prosecutions. This is necessary in order to deliver justice and remedy to the victims and hold offenders accountable to prevent further crimes of this nature from being committed in the future. It is also important to expose the impacts of the alleged offences so that doctors are free to openly share what they have learned about the harms of the COVID-19 vaccines and the treatment protocols that they have developed. There are well-informed doctors who can help the vaccine injured, but many are being slandered and silenced, which is preventing the medical community from learning how to identify and treat COVID-19 vaccine injuries. To assist your investigations, we provide in this witness statement details of the victims, the alleged crimes, the offenders, possible motives, the weapons, the evidence, and the intent and means in respect of lethal offences which we believe have been committed against the people of Australia. We believe the information and evidence presented clearly shows there was no pandemic of death in Australia, safe, effective COVID-19 treatments were available from 2019, so there was never a need for new experimental vaccines. Experimental products were injected without fully informed and legally valid consent. These injections have caused significant harm and death, and our government leaders and regulators failed to protect the people by ignoring calls from independent experts to stop the shots, investigate the reported COVID-19 vaccine deaths and injuries, and conduct critical safety testing that has not yet been done on the experimental COVID-19 vaccines. We can also provide an evidence dossier upon request containing further scientific evidence of the harms of the COVID-19 injections. Many independent experts, both in Australia and internationally, are also available to provide evidence and testimony to assist your investigations. Please listen to the vaccine injured and grieving families when they report alleged offences that have been committed against them. Their injuries and suffering are real, and they need your help. Please do not refuse, prevent, or restrict investigation of the alleged crimes. Don't risk being charged as an accessory when justice is eventually served in the courts. You may recall that "we were just following orders" was not an acceptable defence at the Nuremberg trials. Concerned men and women across Australia wish to restore public trust in our police officers, both state and federal, which has been greatly damaged in recent years, by working with you to provide information and evidence to support you in the investigation of these alleged crimes. We wish to give you the opportunity to show the people of Australia that we can rely on you to protect our rights and freedoms and to uphold the laws of our nation. No one is above the criminal code of law, so the perpetrators of these alleged crimes must be held to account to restore trust in the institutions of our great nation upon which we all rely for safe, healthy, and prosperous lives. We present evidence in this witness statement indicating that tens of thousands of Australians have died and potentially millions more have been severely injured from being injected with experimental medical products, including gene therapy bioweapons, that were mislabelled as vaccines. Do not dismiss these allegations as conspiracy theories. It certainly appears that there has been a conspiracy, but these allegations are not theories. They are provable facts supported by overwhelming, indisputable data and scientific evidence. You may recall many other COVID-19 related facts that were initially labelled by the media as conspiracy theories. Reports of COVID-19 vaccine deaths and injuries can be found in the Australian Government's Database for Adverse Events Notifications, DAEN. Furthermore, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reports on deaths from all causes show an increase in excess deaths each year since the rollout in 2021 of the experimental, inadequately tested products labelled as COVID-19 vaccines. Data from the Australian Government's own vaccine injury reporting system shows that up until December 5, 2024, there have been over 141,000 adverse events reported following COVID-19 vaccination, including almost 23,000 cases with serious adverse events and 1,041 deaths. Independent researcher Sharon Cousins analysed data from the TGA on the time difference in days from COVID-19 vaccination to reported death cases for 1,037 deaths. This analysis shows that 35 or 3% of reported deaths occurred on the day of COVID-19 vaccination. 304 deaths, or 29%, occurred within a week of vaccination, and 543 deaths, or 52%, occurred within 20 days of vaccination. Why isn't the TGA investigating these reported deaths and calling for autopsies to be conducted?
I have in my hands here today the smoking gun that demonstrates that the TGA has not been honest about the safety of the vaccine. And they knew about the risks of the vaccine back in July 2021 when a 52-year-old man passed away 7 days after receiving that Pfizer vaccine. He passed away in his own home in front of his wife and his 16-year-old son. Now, an autopsy was performed on this man, and the pathologist determined that the direct cause of death was rapidly progressing myocarditis following Pfizer COVID-19 vaccination. Now, despite that, this autopsy was eventually given to the TGA, and I'll note that the TGA said in the previous set of estimates that they don't solicit autopsy reports, that they have ignored and failed to report this side effect and this death from the vaccine. And this matters because we know that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Australians got myocarditis and other severe vaccine injuries from the vaccine. Now, if we can't trust the TGA to be honest about this, if we can't trust the TGA to follow due process, then we have got serious issues. We have thousands of Australians out there today who cannot access compensation for the vaccine injury scheme because the TGA refuses to acknowledge the side effects from this vaccine. And yet again, I'll say it again, that the cause of this death was myocarditis. The TGA knows that myocarditis was a side effect from this vaccine, and yet they didn't tell the Australian public. Now, this is urgent because today we are still rolling out the mRNA vaccine. We are still claiming it is safe and effective. So the Minister needs to explain why the Health Minister isn't on the phone to the TGA and the Health Department, requiring them to explain, not just to the Minister, but to the Australian people, why they failed to inform the Australian people of the risks of that vaccine. Because this matters, because thousands of people have been injured by the vaccine. They need to be compensated. And it also raises the other issue of how many other autopsies were sent to the TGA that they didn't bother disclosing to the Australian public. Because this is about due process. We cannot have the body, the bureaucrats who approved this vaccine, then being the same people to administer the injuries from this vaccine, because there is an inherent conflict of interest to cover up these injuries because it will show that they didn't do proper testing on this vaccine. Not that we need the evidence of that. That was in the product assessment report, page 30. But the point of it is this, is that we want to know from the TGA and the Health Minister how many other autopsy reports were actually performed or sent to the TGA, why the TGA doesn't feel the need to solicit autopsy reports when a reported death is sent to them. How on earth can you continuously monitor the safety of the vaccine if you're not following up on reported deaths? Now, we know that the TGA never rang the family. We know that the family has never even been compensated by the Australian government. What sort of government do we have when we mandate the rollout of a vaccine? We don't warn people about all the risks of the vaccine, and then when they get injured, we leave them without any government support whatsoever. This, I say to my fellow colleagues, is the smoking gun that demonstrates that the Australian people and even you people in this chamber were misled. I am asking you today to support my motion to ask the Minister to explain why the TGA isn't held to account for the damage they have caused.
Whilst these reports of deaths and injuries are alarming, it is well accepted by authorities that the cases reported to government databases typically represent only a very small fraction of the true injuries and deaths. Most people and most doctors simply don't report vaccine injuries. The famous American Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare study of the USA's Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS, concluded that fewer than 1% of vaccine adverse events are reported. And a similar rate of underreporting was noted in the COVID-19 Response Inquiry Report released in October 2024 by the Australian Government. Under the heading of COVID-19 Vaccine Claims Scheme and Vaccine Safety, it stated that statistics from a survey conducted by the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance show 43.7% of participants in their AusVac safety report had at least one adverse event, but only 0.9% reported visiting a GP or emergency department. So based on this underreporting rate of 99%, confirmed by both US and Australian studies, as many as 104,000 deaths may have occurred directly from COVID-19 vaccines and 2.3 million serious adverse reactions. That is almost 1 in 10 Australians who may have been seriously adversely affected by these products, taken under the assurance by all government leaders and health authorities that they were safe and effective.
Australia is working hard to ensure we all have access to safe, effective and free COVID-19 vaccines.
But even so, I think that demonstrates that we do need to continue to stress the vaccines as being safe and effective.
What's the message for the public? It's safe, it's effective, it will help protect you.
Australia's COVID-19 vaccines have passed the Therapeutic Goods Administration's strict tests, which means they are safe and effective.
The COVID-19 vaccines are very safe and effective.
The COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective for children.
Over 1,500 children received that vaccine in that clinical trial, and it proved highly safe and effective in that trial.
Ever since taking the trial COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer in 2020, 14-year-old Maddie DeGarry has experienced extreme reactions and had to be placed in a wheelchair. Now, over 2 years later, Maddie is still in serious condition with vision problems, poor neck control, waist-down numbness, and she needs a feeding tube. Stephanie DeGarry is Maddie's mother, and she joins us now. Has anyone from Pfizer or the federal government reached out to you to see what is going on with Maddie and why she has not recovered from this trial vaccine?
No, they have not. I feel like we're living in a horror movie, to be honest with you. I don't know how else to describe it.
And it's fascinating because you would think that Pfizer would want to know what happened to the children in their trial. And our federal government continues to recommend the vaccine for children and even babies. What are your thoughts on that?
They should not be recommending this for children or babies. There's no benefit to it. There's only bad things that are going to happen, and there's more and more kids that this is happening to. And worse yet, they're dying.
After Pfizer and the federal government and our health officials ignored what happened to your child, and it is serious what happened to her, very serious, you tried to join a Facebook group, a community of other vax-injured people, and they took down the group. They won't even let you get support from other people who are experiencing. Why do you think that was censored, that those groups were taken down from social media? Why does the government and Pfizer want to make you feel isolated?
So there are several groups that were taken down. You basically had to talk in code. I think that they wanted to take them down because they didn't want the truth out.
From the outset, these claims of safe and effective were misinformation. This was clear when our Australian Health Minister Greg Hunt stated publicly in 2021 that we were part of the largest global vaccination trial ever.
And the world doesn't know that answer. The world is engaged in the largest clinical trial, the largest global vaccination trial ever, and we will have enormous amounts of data.
In light of our participation in the global clinical trial, it is understandable why victims of these alleged crimes are presenting at hospitals in consistently high numbers. Over recent years, there have been many persistent media reports of our healthcare system and ambulance fleets being overwhelmed. In March 2023, the Courier Mail reported, Queensland is in the grip of a sickness tsunami, with cases of potentially life-threatening viruses, gastrobugs, flu, sexually transmitted diseases, and bacterial infections soaring by up to 800%. These so-called COVID-19 vaccines should have been stopped immediately by Australian authorities when just a few deaths were reported. The Austrian authorities suspended AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine in March 2021 as a precaution while investigating the death of just one person and the illness of another after the shots.
I've worked with the TGA here in Australia for more than 4 decades. And I can tell you from my experience, any drug that had 1/10 of 1% of the reported safety issues related to a product would have been withdrawn.
There have been hundreds of thousands of reports globally from doctors, scientists, data analysts, and the victims themselves about the tsunami of injuries and deaths from these injections labelled as vaccines. Yet our mainstream media and government leaders remain silent on these crimes against humanity, refusing to acknowledge that these victims' injuries and deaths are real and not rare.
Serious adverse events were very rare. And as I say, no myocarditis has been reported in the children receiving this vaccine so far. But on the whole, as I say, this vaccine has proven very safe in that group, potentially partly due to that dose reduction. But it is also still, despite that, providing very high levels of protection. On careful analysis of the risks and benefits in the clinical trial and that real-world experience shows that this vaccine provides high levels of protection, above 90%, and is very safe.
And the good thing about that vaccine, and all 4 are obviously very safe and effective, or they wouldn't be approved and in use in our country.
There is a real risk out there for that last 5 or 10% of high-risk people of getting really sick and dying if they're not vaccinated. It's 5 weeks between one dose and full protection.
Russell Broadbent, member for Monash in Victoria. COVID-19 vaccine injuries have taken a toll on thousands of Australians and their families. And many are still suffering and struggling with the impacts. Over the weekend, the Daily Mail in Brisbane reported on 2 women who have suffered horrific vaccine injuries. It's clear from the comments online that there's a growing groundswell of vaccine-injured Australians that are rightly fed up with being ignored and abandoned. The COVID compensation scheme was supposed to be a quick and easy access safety net because the government acknowledged that there were risks. They just didn't advertise it. No doubt convinced by the safe and effective mantra at the time. Australians trusted the government to protect them with a so-called safe and effective vaccine and help them if anything went wrong. But that's not what's happening. That is not what's happening. I've said it before, and I will say it again, the cruel and callous treatment of our vax-injured has all the hallmarks of the Robodebt tragedies that were a mess. Vax-injured Australians deserve better. That's justice as I see it.
The alleged criminal actions are that dangerous poisons, mislabelled as vaccines, were approved, promoted, mandated and injected into millions of Australians under coercion and without their fully informed and legally valid consent, causing injuries and deaths. We believe that the pharmaceutical companies and alleged perpetrators knew, or should have known, that these products were never safe nor effective. This allegation is supported by numerous reports in the public domain from world-leading doctors, scientists, data analysts and lawyers, and even the manufacturers of these products.
The materials masquerading as vaccines were designed intentionally to harm the people who received them. I'm probably the most qualified former pharmaceutical company research executive in the world speaking out on this matter. And since I spent my entire career in the business of working with teams designing molecules to be new potential medicines, I think I am qualified to comment on it, and that is my shocking judgment that has been only reinforced over the last almost 4 years since I first said it.
Yet in spite of the overwhelming reports of death and injury, alleged offenders continue to this day to promote these products to the Australian people and inject them with these dangerous poisons. At worst, this may be organised crime, bioterrorism or genocide. At best, this is criminal negligence, misfeasance, malfeasance or misconduct in public office, as well as false advertising and fraud on the people of Australia. We allege that offences have been committed which have caused a significant number of deaths and injuries to Australian people and which are clearly crimes against humanity. We allege that the suspected perpetrators worked together from 2020 in a planned and coordinated effort, lied to the people, made false claims, presented false and misleading data, invoked fear, silenced experts, broke numerous domestic and international laws and treaties, and covered up evidence of death and injury. We allege that these actions were taken to coerce all Australians, under threat of losing their livelihoods and participation in society, to accept being injected with experimental drugs which included gene therapy bioweapons. We believe the crimes that may have been committed include criminal negligence, misfeasance in public office, malfeasance in public office, misconduct in public office, fraud, false advertising, assault and/or battery, gross negligence manslaughter, corporate manslaughter, murder and conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, conspiracy to administer a poisonous and noxious substance to cause serious harm and death, corruption, blackmail, organised crime, terrorism, bioterrorism, genocide, torture, false imprisonment, multiple breaches of our human rights, war crimes, violation of the Nuremberg Code 1947 on medical experimentation on humans, crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg Code, and treason. There are so many Australian and international laws and treaties that the alleged offenders should have abided by to protect the Australian people from these alleged crimes. But those in power trampled all over our human and legal rights with complete disregard for the death, pain and suffering that they were causing. The actions that led to the deaths and injuries of so many Australians were not just civil matters to be addressed under civil proceedings. We ask Australian police detectives to identify and investigate the criminal actions which also need to be prosecuted under various criminal codes and other legislation and treaties. Each perpetrator must be charged criminally for any crimes that they have committed.
CDC told us and the FDA told us it stays in your arm. We know that's a lie. And it's a toxic protein that gets distributed to every organ system.
Man-made toxin.
Oh yes, this was man-made.
Yeah. Boosters that must be stopped. We need to stop injections immediately, and all of you are saying that.
Yes.
You've described this as the largest crime ever.
I regard it as the crime of the century, yes, because of the insistence of putting this into young adults and children, and the fact that they're trying to use this as a big cover-up for messenger RNA to be the standard vaccination mechanism of the future. I mean, this is gene therapy in children. I mean, the outcome could just be truly catastrophic. 6 billion people have had these vaccines. I mean, that's over 75% of the world's population are at risk of long-term problems with this that we haven't even started to scratch the surface of.
We're talking about serious vaccine injury, and the medical community doesn't want to recognize this disease, doesn't want to investigate it, doesn't want to look at treatment strategies for a population, as you said, of over 400 million people who are severely injured and disabled. Angus has said this is well, I don't know, he says the crime of the century. Maybe it's the biggest crime in history because of the number of the number of people that have been injured and killed by the so-called safe and effective vaccine.
We have witnessed numerous people and organisations that were involved in approving, promoting, mandating and injecting the experimental products, including product manufacturers, leaders of federal, state and territory governments, governors and governors-general, officers of human rights commissions, chief medical and health officers, officers of departments of health and aged care, officers of the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, officers of APRA, Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, ATAGI and other health regulatory and reporting bodies, hospital and health clinic administrators and doctors, officers of the AMA and other non-government health bodies, doctors, pharmacists, nurses and scientists, executives, editors, reporters and presenters at various mainstream media organisations and the ABC national broadcaster, and corporate, business and union leaders. We ask police detectives to identify and investigate all offenders involved in the alleged crimes. We wish police detectives to uncover evidence of the motives for the alleged crimes. To that end, we can only speculate, but the evidence does seem to point to collusion and bioterrorism. We believe there are several plausible motives, including financial gain, bribery, coercion, blackmail, medical experimentation, population control, and possibly population reduction. We also speculate that the plans for the alleged crimes may have been directed by people outside of Australia who have other motives that are not in the interests of the Australian people. Those in power who should have protected us from the alleged crimes and foreign influences have failed in their duty to do so.
It's become clear that people in this country and globally have been steamrolled. It is also clear that it has been coordinated globally. It is also clear that it has been integrated, not just over 6 months, not just over 2.5 years, but it has been planned over decades. The changes to legislation in this country were done so that they could control doctors and people. But the people are waking, and it's thanks to people like Dr. Altman and all the presenters here today, thanks to people like Senator Babette and Craig Kelly. We know and we knew that this is all bullshit and that we've been had. But we are going to hound you down, the people that are guilty. We are going to hound you down and hold you accountable, and we will expose your global agenda so that the people of Australia can be free in the future. Because I love my kids and I'm looking forward to my grandkids. And we are going to save this country.
Now you may be thinking that Senator Roberts is ill-informed, or that he is exaggerating in his claims that the pandemic and vaccine rollout has been coordinated globally, planned over decades, and the changes in legislation in this country were done so that they could control doctors and people. These claims do seem quite extraordinary to those who are not well informed of the facts. But these claims are well supported by many global experts, including Dr. David Martin, who has been a biological weapons expert advisor to the US government for 25 years. Here are some key facts, fully supported by documented evidence, which have been presented by Dr. Martin to numerous US and other government leaders around the world, including the European Parliament. Dr. Martin outlines that various patents exist on coronaviruses, with initial filings dating back to 2002.
SARS is actually not a natural progression of a zoonotic modification of coronavirus. As a matter of fact, very specifically, in 1999, Anthony Fauci funded research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, specifically to create, and you cannot help but lament what I'm about to read, because this comes directly from a patent application filed on April 19th, 2002, and you heard the date correctly, 2002, where the NIAID built an infectious replication defective coronavirus that was specifically targeted for human lung epithelium. In other words, we made SARS. And we patented it on April 19th, 2002, before there was ever any alleged outbreak in Asia, which, as you know, followed that by several months. That patent, issued as U.S. Patent 7279327, that patent clearly lays out in very specific gene sequencing the fact that we knew that the ACE receptor, the ACE2 binding domain, the S1 spike protein, and other elements of what we have come to know as this scourge pathogen was not only engineered, but could be synthetically modified in the laboratory using nothing more than gene sequencing technologies, taking computer code and turning it into a pathogen or an intermediate of the pathogen.
Dr. Martin also details with evidence that SARS-CoV-2, which causes the COVID-19 disease, was not a new pathogen that suddenly emerged from nature in 2019. The Australian public were told that this was a natural mutation of a bat virus, which originated from a wet market in Wuhan, China. These were blatant lies promulgated by numerous leaders around the world, including our own Health Minister Greg Hunt. But COVID-19 was not a new novel disease, as the Australian public were told. It was funded to become a bioweapon through gain-of-function research. Gain-of-function is medical research that genetically alters an organism in a way that may enhance the biological functions of gene products. This may include altering the onset or progression of the disease, its transmissibility, and the types of hosts that it can infect. US officials grew uneasy after the publication of new gain-of-function papers and several accidents in US biocontainment labs. So in October 2014, they announced a pause on funding for gain-of-function studies. Yet studies on the SARS-CoV-2 pathogen were allowed to continue at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. It now appears that the research there was funded by the US government via a non-government organisation known as the EcoHealth Alliance. The former head of the CDC in America, Robert Redfield, has stated this in recent publications. Dr. David Martin outlines clear evidence of a plan to release the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The vaccine is a countermeasure that the people were told would protect them from the COVID-19 disease.
The overall flow of what became what we called COVID-19 that allegedly took place in 2019 December did not start in 2019 at all. As a matter of fact, my first briefing on the SARS bioterrorism threat was in 2002. In 2005, and a lot of people don't like when I use this language, and I apologize if I've offended anybody, but the reason I use it is because it is the language used by the perpetrators. This was funded to be a bioweapon for civilian deployment in 2005. And by this I mean the SARS coronavirus was actually funded to become the bioweapon of choice in 2005. And beginning in 2005, the gain-of-function research that you've all heard about multiple times was actually jointly commissioned by NIAID and by DARPA to be the bioweapon choice used, and I quote, for biological warfare enabling technology. In 2010, when Moderna started as a corporation, its early patents were filed around modifying mRNA for the purpose of ultimately responding to biological threats, none of which existed. And when the gain-of-function moratorium was put in place in 2014, in October of 2014, Anthony Fauci's NIAID sent the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill a note saying that they were authorized to continue their gain-of-function research on, are you ready for this? Not just SARS coronavirus, ladies and gentlemen, the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Did you hear the date that I just gave you? That was October of 2014, that the NIAID authorized gain-of-function research on the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1 for the purpose of weaponizing it for the promotion of the global acceptance of a vaccine. And a lot of people say, well, Dave, but my gosh, and by the way, all the references are here. This is not a raving lunatic. This is just me reporting the facts, which I've done as a biological weapons expert for the U.S. government for the last 25 years. In 2016, there was a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and that publication read, SARS-like WIV1-CoV poised for human emergence. Let's unpack exactly what that means. That's SARS. That's Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1, poised for human emergence. That was a headline in the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. Let me tell you, my organization, MCAM, currently monitors 68 gain-of-function weapons that are currently in production. Listen to what I just said, 68 of them. You think SARS is the only thing we're going to have? No. SARS and SARS-like variants were 3 of 68 that we have in production right now in the United States, and I've briefed on this since 2002. And then we have, unfortunately, the language that was used in September 18th of 2019, 3 months before patient 1 in Wuhan, where the statement was made, an accidental or intentional release of a lethal respiratory pathogen will be authorized so that by September 2020, the world accepts a universal vaccine. Ladies and gentlemen, there was no public health emergency. SARS was identified in 1965 as the most malleable of all of the viral models that could be used for biological weapons. By 1966 and 1967, it was the first infectious agent that was used in a cross-Atlantic collaboration on infecting a healthy population. Samples of a coronavirus from the United States were infected into healthy British subjects in 1966. It worked. And ever since then, it's been developed for the very purpose for which it was put in motion. By 1984, it was actually the subject of what became a series of patents ultimately filed by Pfizer. And in 1990, they filed their first spike protein patent for a spike protein vaccine. In 1990, how many of you heard about Operation Warp Speed? And when the CDC filed the patent illegally in April of 2003 on the coronavirus allegedly isolated from humans, they had to actually pay the patent office after the patent office on 3 occasions ruled the patent invalid and unenforceable. They had to pay to take over the ownership of SARS coronavirus so they could control the economic gain from that particular pathogen. Never forget this particular quote. And those are the perpetrators: Ralph Baric at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Anthony Fauci at NIAID, and Peter Daszak at EcoHealth Alliance. Their official statement, this is not me spinning or quoting or anything, this is actually straight out of their publication, their presentation to the National Academy of Sciences. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, we need to increase the public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza, pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Ladies and gentlemen, this was murder. It was not public health. And we need to stop pretending it was something other than what it was. People died. And people died of medical countermeasures that actually were known to be biological weapons in 2005. They knew they were participating in a program that the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board in September of 2019 stated was going to be the accidental or intentional release of a lethal respiratory pathogen, ladies and gentlemen, not any respiratory pathogen. They used the word lethal. And you know what that means? That means this is premeditated murder. That's what it means.
We will show data from Australia and globally which clearly demonstrates that the COVID-19 virus itself was no more lethal than the seasonal flu, but the mRNA vaccine countermeasures were dangerous bioweapons that were planned for widespread release to the global population. Evidence presented by Dr. Martin brings into question whether deaths and injuries from these COVID-19 mRNA vaccines were the result of premeditated crimes. Event 201 also raises legitimate inquiry about whether the release of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and COVID vaccine countermeasures was premeditated. Event 201 was a pandemic tabletop exercise hosted by the Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on October 18, 2019 in New York. The exercise outlined the pandemic preparedness efforts needed to reduce large-scale economic and societal consequences of a severe pandemic caused by a new respiratory pathogen. Is it just a coincidence that a tabletop exercise based on a fictional scenario to plan how to respond to a respiratory disease outbreak was held only 2 months before the COVID-19 outbreak was announced to the world? We accept that not all of those involved in the alleged offences were aware of any alleged agenda, such as to use the media to create hype so that the world would accept a universal vaccine. People may have unknowingly committed offences due to ignorance, arrogance, or incompetence, but this does not diminish their culpability for offences such as criminal negligence, misfeasance in public office, or manslaughter, where their actions or inactions have led to deaths and injuries of Australian people. Those involved should have listened to the true independent experts and abided by the many laws, regulations and treaties that exist to protect the people and preserve our fundamental human rights. But they failed in their duty to do so. It is well established in law that being an accomplice to a crime is a criminal act in itself. These facts can be somewhat overwhelming if you are hearing them for the first time, but they may provide insight into why such extraordinary tyrannical measures were undertaken to push the COVID-19 vaccines with such fervour, even while more and more evidence was mounting daily that they were neither safe nor effective. Three key weapons were used to commit the alleged crimes. 1. A fraudulent COVID-19 PCR test campaign that reported a high number of false positive test results. 2. Various pharmaceutical products mislabelled as vaccines. And 3. Reporting of manipulated and false data and narratives. Weapon 1. The PCR test. This weapon was instrumental in creating the fear of a pandemic. The inventor of the PCR test, Nobel Prize winner Dr. Kary Mullis, is on record as saying that, quote, "You cannot interpret the results of the PCR test to diagnose disease," unquote.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
The US Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, announced in July 2021 that they were retiring the PCR test for SARS-CoV-2 testing, effective from the end of 2021. Furthermore, in the Lisbon Court of Appeal in Portugal, the judges condemned the PCR test as unreliable. The conclusion of the 34-page ruling included the following. In view of current scientific evidence, this test shows itself to be unable to determine beyond reasonable doubt that a positive result corresponds, in fact, to the infection of a person by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The Portuguese judges cited a study conducted by some of the leading European and world specialists, which was published by Oxford Academic in September 2020. It showed that if someone tested positive for COVID-19 at a test cycle threshold of 35 or higher, the chances of that person actually being infected is less than 3%, and that the probability of receiving a false positive result is 97% or higher. Australian government authorities were aware, or should have been aware, that the PCR test was not fit for purpose, but they used it to falsely diagnose healthy people, which caused fear amongst the population that we were in the grips of a deadly COVID pandemic. In fact, Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows clearly that the number of deaths from all causes were in line with the baseline average during 2020, when the government and media-driven COVID-19 panic was in full force. There was no pandemic of excess death in Australia at any time during this period. However, there was a surge in deaths from all causes in the last quarter of 2021 and throughout 2022. This followed a surge in COVID-19 vaccinations in Australia during the second half of 2021. Did you know that the World Health Organization changed the definition of the word pandemic in 2009 during the H1N1 influenza outbreak? The change involved removing the requirement for a pandemic to cause enormous numbers of deaths and illness, and instead focused on the spread of the disease. This adjustment means the WHO can declare a pandemic even when there is no increase in deaths and illness. The PCR test, which falsely diagnosed healthy people as being infected with COVID-19, meant that the WHO could declare COVID-19 as a pandemic under the revised definition, as the high number of false positive cases indicated spread of the disease. But the general public, who are unlikely aware of this revised definition, most likely assumed the declaration of a pandemic meant enormous numbers of deaths and illness. Weapon 2. The mislabelled vaccines, which were falsely promoted as the only way out of the fake pandemic.
Does a dab in the arm vaccine, can that possibly protect you against being infected with COVID-19? Well, I have to be quite emphatic now, categorical, and use my authority as one of the researchers 50 years ago developing the concept of local mucosal immunity and secretory IgA in the nose, mouth and gastrointestinal tract. None of those vaccines put into the arms can possibly activate that immunity. They say it can't work, just on first principles. Now, what angers me is that Big Pharma, all my scientific colleagues in Australia, Peter Doherty, John Shine, all the senior scientists advocating the vaccine, they know that. They know the vaccine can't work. It doesn't activate local mucosal oronasal immunity. You have to induce that, and that's how herd immunity develops in the population, by the way. That's how we get natural immunity. And none of the current jab in the arms can possibly activate that immunity. So the first thing, and I want to say it emphatically, and I'll take on all comers on this one, it can't work. They can't work. So that is a big lie that has been pushed on the human population. Now, they've got all these serious adverse side effects, so the long-term effects now down the years are going to be horrendous.
3 key products were used in Australia, manufactured by AstraZeneca, Moderna and Pfizer. It should be noted that the definition of vaccine was changed in September 2021 by the United States Centre for Disease Control. This appears to have been done so that these products could continue to be called vaccines, because by this point in the pandemic, it was clear that these products did not prevent infection or transmission of COVID-19. This change in definition misled the public into believing that these new mRNA products were equivalent to conventional vaccines and conventional vaccine technologies. This is not true. These were completely new technologies being used at population-level scale for the first time ever. In respect of the Pfizer product, a Pfizer representative admitted in European Parliament in 2022 that Pfizer had never tested their product to determine if it could stop transmission of the COVID-19 virus.
Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it's entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market.
This is scandalous. Millions of people worldwide felt forced to get vaccinated because of the myth that you do it for others. Now, this turned out to be a cheap lie. This should be exposed.
It is worth noting that as of October 2024, the CDC removed the page with the vaccine definition from their website. The Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, regulates the approval of new drugs in Australia. In 2018, the TGA introduced new provisional approval pathway procedures to apply to the approval of new experimental drugs. These new procedures were introduced the year before the start of the alleged pandemic and allowed the TGA to fast-track approval for use of the new experimental COVID-19 vaccines. But it is important to understand that normal TGA drug approval guidelines require significantly more safety testing before products can be deemed safe for use by the Australian people. Under the new Provisional Approval Pathway Guidelines, These products were approved for use without critical safety testing being performed, such as testing for effects on pregnant women and their babies, and toxicity testing to check for potential side effects such as causing cancer and mutagenicity. Also, no long-term safety data was available to ensure there would be no potential harm over time from these new drugs. It is simply unfathomable to think that anyone could claim that these new experimental drugs were safe and effective for all people in all medical circumstances when important product safety data was not available to confirm these claims. The AstraZeneca vaccine was developed in partnership with Oxford University and uses a monkey virus vector. This product has a serious side effect of blood clotting, a fact that has been known since these reactions were first reported in 2021. AstraZeneca has now withdrawn their COVID vaccine worldwide after almost 3 years and 3 billion doses administered since Austria suspended this product in March 2021, immediately following the first death from its use. The Moderna COVID-19 vaccine is an mRNA gene therapy product for which there have also been many reports of serious side effects. The Japanese regulatory authorities suspended 1.6 million doses of Moderna COVID-19 vaccine in August 2021 due to product contamination, with several vaccination centres reporting that foreign substances were found inside unopened vials. The Pfizer product is another mRNA gene therapy product mislabeled as a COVID-19 vaccine. The TGA granted provisional approval to the Pfizer gene therapy without first obtaining review and approval by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, as required in Australia for all gene therapies. This was a concern raised by Senator Rennick in a Senate hearing in October 2023.
I have a Pfizer document here from their own website. Gene therapies are a delicate and intentional process encapsulating the desired gene. Manufacturing gene therapies is challenging and it requires certain steps, including transfection. That is on Pfizer's own website. And then I have also from the website of the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, because the vaccine, it's referring to the COVID mRNA vaccine, introduces new genetic material into cells for a short period of time to induce antibodies. It is a gene therapy as defined by the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy. And then the TGA's own Pfizer non-clinical report, page 19, says the proposed commercial scale manufacturing process includes use of linearized plasmid DNA template for mRNA production. Why wasn't the actual mRNA vaccine tested for genotoxicity?
Pfizer documents released in 2022 under a US court order revealed several pages of side effects of their COVID-19 vaccine. This information was not previously disclosed to the public to enable them to make informed decisions about taking this product. How could the TGA approve this product and deem it to be safe to inject into Australians when it has hundreds of potential side effects?
Release of the Pfizer documents just a few days ago, we saw that the actual list of adverse events of serious interest side effects that they were looking at was something like 6 pages, single space, small font. I mean, the list was hundreds of things that they were looking at, which makes sense given that this is a new category of drug. By the way, they changed the definition of vaccine so that they could call these vaccines. We have Pfizer and Moderna documents. I can show you, take a look at the SEC filings, acknowledging that mRNA is a gene therapy. So that, to me, that conversation is laid to rest. Pfizer and Moderna have both admitted openly in federal filings that mRNA technology is gene therapy. So, that makes it so that these are a new category of drugs. So if you're wondering why so many side effects are possible, it's because it's an untested category of drug. We don't have the 10 to 15 year development cycle you'd normally have, so they don't know what's going to happen. What's turned out to happen is a nightmare.
I can tell you, after spending a career in this industry, you can no more make a baby in 1 month with 9 women than you can make a complicated biological product in 10 months. It cannot be done. It was not done. They did something else. They created materials which were essentially injected poisons. They were not vaccines. And when you've listened to what I've just told you, you know that must be true. because you can't do something in 10 months that normally takes 6 to 12 years.
It was also not disclosed to the public that the original Pfizer trial reports revealed that more people died in the vaccinated group than in the unvaccinated placebo group over the course of the study. Pfizer also vaccinated the placebo group after a further 3 months, which removed any possibility of obtaining long-term data comparing the two groups.
To fully understand the issue of excess deaths, there needs to be proper scrutiny of the intervention that was implemented on more than 90% of the Australian population. That's COVID-19 vaccination. More than 50% of the Australian population took Pfizer's mRNA vaccine. At the pivotal point of Pfizer's vaccine approval in December 2020, there was a gross misrepresentation in what was presented publicly. Instead of the 6 deaths publicly disclosed, 4 placebo, 2 vaccinated, suggesting a benefit of vaccination, there were in fact 11 deaths, with more deaths in the vaccinated arm, 6. We found undisclosed deaths, especially in the vaccinated arm of this clinical trial, in contravention to legal and ethical obligations of trial sponsors.
There are many other important facts to consider in respect of the COVID-19 injections, too many to include in this witness statement. But here are 4 further key facts to note. 1. Significant media reports have been released confirming that the mRNA vaccines cause myocarditis and pericarditis, which can cause life-threatening damage to the heart and surrounding tissue. This is likely causing the increase in sudden deaths by heart attack in people who were healthy prior to COVID-19 vaccination.
The other thing I want to stress is that the reports in VAERS and in the other vaccine reporting systems like VG Access in Europe or EudraVigilance, the yellow card reporting system in the UK, they actually show that the injuries from the COVID-19 vaccines, the reports are decreasing. So there was less in 2022 and then a lot less in 2023, but the deaths are not showing that. The deaths are actually on an upward trajectory, and that's what's being buried. That's what's being covered up. We used to be able to save most of these people, especially young people. When they had a cardiac arrest, we would save the vast majority of them, right? We could bring them back. We could, you could get them to a cath lab. You could save these patients. But when it's vaccine related, when it's COVID vaccine related injury, which is completely different, it's a completely different type of myocarditis, completely different type of cardiomyopathy, you cannot save most of these people. It's just once they collapse, it's over. You can do CPR, you can defibrillate them. In the vast, vast majority of cases, they die. And again, no one's questioning that.
2. There have also been numerous reports of significant increases in many other diseases and illnesses. One such concern is the rise of what is now being labelled as turbocancer. Turbocancer is the term used when a person presents with cancer for the first time, which is already at stage 4. There are many reports globally that this is occurring in younger people.
Well, as I started looking at the sudden deaths of Canadian doctors, I realized, yes, most of them are dying from cardiac issues, heart injuries, cardiac arrests, dying while jogging or swimming, dying in their sleep. And Dr. Peter McCullough has talked about this extensively, about the myocarditis and the damage to the heart, the scarring to the heart. And then some were dying from blood clots, pulmonary emboli, strokes. But then there was quite a large subset of doctors who were developing extremely aggressive cancers. And cancers at an age that they shouldn't be getting. So, for example, there was a doctor who developed gastric cancer in his 30s. Presented at stage 4, he was dead in less than a year. Very rare brain cancers in young individuals in their 20s and 30s, medical students, medical residents. And these cancers would always present at stage 4, and they would always kill them in a matter of a few months, and it was always less than a year. And, at first I didn't know, what the term for this was or what the phenomenon was. I just started, really paying attention to it, tracking it. I then, realized that this is being called turbocancer by people on social media. Turbocancer is not a medical term, but it's a term that people came up with to really describe the extremely aggressive nature of these cancers in the COVID vaccinated. And these cancers behave completely differently, unlike anything I've seen before in my career. And I've diagnosed over 20,000 cancer patients in my career with cutting-edge PET-CT, positron emission tomography imaging, CT, MRI, pathological correlation. I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen stage 4 breast cancers presenting in women in their 20s. I've never seen stage 4 colon cancers presenting in men and women in their 20s, 30s. Leukemias that will kill you in a matter of days or even hours after diagnosis. Lymphomas that, again, kill you in a matter of months.
They're denying any link to the vaccine. They're recognizing that young people who are vaccinated are coming down with these extremely aggressive cancers. Stage 4 cancers, we've never seen this, right? Young people, if they're going to be diagnosed with a cancer, breast cancer patient, you might have a 35-year-old breast cancer patient. She comes in, it's a stage 1, maybe a 1.5 centimeter lump in her breast, and you go, oh my God, you're 35, you have stage 1 cancer. Let's do genetic testing. Let's test for BRCA1 mutation. Let's look at your family history. Did your mom have breast cancer at the age of 40 or 50? Like, that was the situation. And it was rare. Now we have a 20-year-old girl who had 2 COVID-19 vaccines to be able to continue, to be able to attend university, presenting with stage 4 breast cancer, metastatic to bones, liver, sometimes brain, and she dies within 6 months. She dies at 20 years old. And there's thousands of these cases. I've reported literally over 1,000 cases of these turbo cancers on my social media. We have never seen this before. And the doctors are just burying their head in the sand. They don't want to see it. They don't want to talk about it. They give them the standard chemo. The standard chemo doesn't work. And these young people are dying. And they're dying by the thousands.
Stage 4 cancers are also being diagnosed in those who were in remission from cancer for many years prior to COVID-19 vaccination.
Can you explain in simple terms what it is that you are seeing that has got the alarm bells ringing?
Well, the first thing I saw doing a regular melanoma clinic that I've been doing for years was that I was starting to see people who were stable, that we've been doing immunotherapy for over 20 years. And I was starting to see people who've been stable for 5, 10, even 20 years relapse, really unusually. They're very fit and healthy. And I've occasionally seen this when somebody gets very depressed, they get knocked back, a bereavement, a divorce, bankruptcy for months. And we know this depression is associated with immune suppression. So I have seen that 2 or 3 times. And I looked for this in these patients, and there was absolutely no evidence. They were all perfectly happy. So I basically said, what have they all got in common? And they'd all got in common was they'd had the first booster vaccine. It was around this time. And I was able to show that they'd had it, then the relapse started between about 3 weeks and 3 months after the booster vaccine.
Australia has administered more than 60 million doses of these vaccines to over 20 million people. Australia's governmental health authorities have chosen not to monitor new or emerging cancer trends following the widespread use of these vaccines. It is troubling that the Department of Health has not made data on cancer trends post-vaccination publicly available. It is their responsibility to do so. This is a critical gap in public health oversight. Given the massive contamination levels of rogue residual DNA in the Australian vials, we must expect an ongoing rise in cancers and other genetic disorders in Australia. This issue is a potential long-term health crisis waiting to happen. This matter must be taken seriously by every Australian. We must advocate for immediate public health responses. We need our health authorities to begin monitoring these trends.
3. Many other world-renowned experts have also publicly confirmed the claim by Dr. David Martin that the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID-19 vaccine countermeasures are in fact bioweapons. Law Professor Dr. Francis Boyle, who drafted the 1989 Biological Weapons and Anti-Terrorism Act, has publicly stated that COVID-19 mRNA injections are biological weapons and that they are designed to cause injury and death. He has provided an affidavit in a Florida legal case that seeks to compel Governor DeSantis to prohibit the distribution of COVID-19 injections and also to confiscate the vials. Dr. Richard Fleming, physicist, nuclear cardiologist, and attorney, has also testified under oath that COVID-19 is a bioweapon. He has called for a grand jury to address crimes against humanity in respect of the gain-of-function research on SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 vaccines. Please watch his compelling expert testimony in full at the link on your screen. Here is a brief clip from his testimony.
Be totally off base if they believe these vaccines were in and of themselves a bioweapon.
Well, the fact that the spike protein is a gain-of-function developed virus, which by definition is a bioweapon, replicating that same genetic sequence and putting it into a vaccine, it doesn't matter how you get it into the human body, it's still a bioweapon. Most alarmingly for the children right now, when you have people at an FDA meeting making a statement that we need to vaccinate the children, but we won't know what happens to them until we vaccinate them, that's the experimental phase of a research project. And as of 1947, I thought that we had officially, although it's very clear from the Tuskegee Airmen and other studies that have been done, paid for by the U.S. government, that it seems that our leaders don't have a problem experimenting on our elderly, on our police officers, on our first responders, on our doctors and nurses, on our general public, and now apparently don't have a problem experimenting on our children.
Why didn't our government leaders and regulators abide by Australian and international laws and regulations which would have protected the Australian people from this biological attack? What crimes were committed that enabled these dangerous bioweapons, labelled as vaccines, to be approved, promoted, mandated and injected in Australia? 4. Canadian molecular virologist Dr. David Speaker analysed Australian vials of Pfizer and Moderna COVID-19 vaccines. The results were so alarming that MP Russell Broadbent wrote to advise the Prime Minister, twice. His letters and Dr. Speaker's test results were tabled by Councillor Adrian McRae at a meeting of the Town of Port Hedland Council on the 11th of October 2024 to specifically discuss the ramifications of Dr. Speaker's report on their constituents.
The report by Dr. David Speaker, presented in Exhibit 1 of tonight's motion, evidences levels of synthetic DNA contamination by up to 145 times higher than Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, up to 145 times higher than the TGA's own safety limits. For those unfamiliar, the TGA limits are there for a reason, because synthetic DNA has been shown to integrate into human cells, leading to potential long-term health risks like cancer, genomic instability, vascular thromboses and blood clotting, as well as immune system disruptions. Dr. Speaker's findings are alarming, but they are also far from isolated. Independent studies now in Canada, Germany and the US have all confirmed similar levels of contamination. International experts, including some of the world's leading oncologists, geneticists, virologists, immunologists, microbiologists and biochemists, have joined forces to warn governments around the world, including our own government, about the dangers these contaminants pose. This is why the Honourable Russell Broadbent MP, the federal member for Monash, has written multiple letters to the Prime Minister urging an immediate investigation and suspension of these vaccines. Yet the response from our government has been nothing but silence. Not a word from the Prime Minister, not a word from the Minister of Health, despite receiving clear scientific evidence that millions of Australians could be at risk, including those folks right here in Port Hedland who were forced to take these experimental shots and continue to take these dangerous shots. Yet the government has chosen to remain silent. We now have evidence that has been undoubtedly forwarded and shared with the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and with the Secretary of Health Blair Comley, that the contamination is significant. It's widespread and it's downright disturbing. Yet none of these high-ranking officials has stepped forward to address this publicly. None has even attempted to explain why this contamination was allowed to go on for so long unnoticed. But let's talk about what this means for us, the residents of Port Hedland. Exhibit 3, the science summary attached to Mr. Broadbent's second letter, presents a stark reality. In every vial of Australian-sourced mRNA vaccine, every single shot tested by Dr. Speaker, the levels of synthetic DNA contamination were so high that one shot could contain as many as 24 trillion synthetic DNA fragments. Trillion with a T. Think about that. Each one of us has around 37 trillion cells in our body, and one shot could be putting 24 trillion foreign DNA fragments into our bloodstream, with potentially billions of those fragments being the simian virus 40, SV40. SV40 is a genetic material that has been known for years to cause cancer. The science summary makes it clear. Only 3 to 10 of these SV40 fragments are needed to trigger what is called insertional mutagenesis, which is a scientific term for cancer-causing genetic changes. When I say 3, I mean 3. Not 300, not 3,000, not even 3 million. If just 3 to 10 fragments are needed to begin the cancer mutation process, what happens when someone receives billions of these SV40 fragments in a single shot? What happens when these contaminant shots are administered multiple times, as they have been, to millions of Australians, including Australian children? I've got a Freedom of Information Act, Freedom of Information request from probably one of Australia's leading independent investigative journalists, Rebecca Barnett. And she wanted to find out what methods our government was using, our TGA, it's not even our government, it's a bureaucratic establishment, what methods they were using to test for this contamination or lack of contamination, of DNA contamination in our COVID-19 vaccines. And I could show the council's seen. It's just a bunch of blank redacted pages, as you'd expect from the TGA when they're going through their usual butt-covering exercises. But one thing they forgot to redact was the actual lines which said exactly their method of testing, which is a system called quantitative polymerase chain reaction, qPCR. On page 16 of Moderna's patent for this mRNA technology, tells you exactly how not to find excess DNA fragments. And what they tell you to do is don't use qualitative polymerase chain reaction, qPCR. Exactly what our TGA is using to gaslight anyone that asks questions about these vaccines and saying, no, they're safe, we've tested. They're using a testing method that deliberately doesn't find the contamination.
On 23rd of October 2024, Port Hedland Councillor Camilo Blanco wrote to all local government councils and shires in Australia to advise them of Dr. Speaker's findings and Russell Broadbent's letters to the Prime Minister. Concerned Australians are also asking their local councillors to follow the lead of the town of Port Hedland to protect the people. As of the recording of this witness statement, 5 councils have responded. Here are some highlights of presentations at other council meetings around Australia.
Councils across Australia are being approached by ordinary people like me, following the Port Hedland Council historic motion on the 11th of October 2024. An excellent resource website called porthedlandmotion.info has been painstakingly developed to help councillors, councils, medical and health professionals, politicians, media and everyday Australians. As we liaise with councils, we are ambassadors for truth and for public health and safety, because those watching across Australia and globally are extremely alarmed at the information of the high levels of DNA contamination that have been found in Pfizer and Moderna files, and this has been known since 2023 via Japanese scientists and laboratories across the world, including the recent report which I will table, dated the 9th of September from Dr. David Speaker in Canada, a virologist. The West Tamar Council in Tasmania and Ceduna Council in South Australia have also agreed to support this Port Hedland Council motion as a matter of public importance as it relates to community and public health and safety.
Delivered within lipid nanoparticles which can cross every membrane in the body, including the blood-brain barrier and the placenta, a substance that biodistributes to the heart, brain, liver, kidneys, ovaries and testes, even the bone marrow. Designed to hijack our cellular machinery to produce the maximum possible quantity of a foreign pathogenic spike protein. These biologics are the most hazardous therapeutics in existence, and as such should have been subjected to the most rigorous safety testing possible. Now it's left to the general population, the guinea pigs, to prove harm. And prove it we have, but has the TGA listened? I'm here to tell you that what I'm seeing and hearing in the community is a looming medical disaster that will make the thalidomide scandals pale in comparison. The side effects from these mRNA vaccines are not very rare as the media would have us believe. There are more adverse events reported for the COVID vaccines in their first year of rollout than for the total adverse event reports for all non-COVID vaccines over the past 50 years.
The evidence is now overwhelming that the mRNA synthetic gene injections, falsely marketed as vaccines, were deadly. My own workmate was only 40, extremely fit and healthy and loved by all. Suddenly out of the blue diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and dead within a couple of months. He leaves behind a devastated widow. Cancer used to be a disease that predominantly affected the elderly. Now it's killing many more children and healthy young adults. Just about anyone you speak to has a similar story, a family member or friend who died suddenly or is suffering debilitating illness after taking this deadly jab. We heard from Avril on Monday night of a healthy 17-year-old cousin who died a week after taking the jab. I recently spoke to a local nurse from Port Macquarie Base Hospital who took the jab reluctantly to keep her job, then woke up in intensive care with breathing tubes and had to undergo a tracheotomy. That nurse wanted to speak at the public forum but was unable to do so. A local pharmacist called me this week and relayed that the number of people on medication for severe immune disorders has increased tenfold in the last year. These are rare and expensive medications. He said IVF treatments, Alzheimer's treatments and many others have increased by a similar magnitude.
If the people had been told the truth about these products, how many Australians do you believe would have consented to themselves and their children being injected with experimental gene therapy bioweapons?
Ultimately, the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body, we would have probably had a 95% refusal rate. I think this pandemic has also opened many people's eyes to innovation in the way that was maybe not possible before.
Weapon 3. Reporting of false data and narratives. The weaponisation of media reports was used to perpetuate the fear and coerce the trusting population to take the unsafe and ineffective vaccines. This strategy aligns with the evidence presented by Dr. David Martin that media hype was needed to promote the global acceptance of a vaccine. In 2020 and 2021, COVID-19 infection and death rates were reported daily through mainstream media by state premiers, chief ministers, and chief medical and health officers. But this data was manipulated in many ways to exaggerate the risk of death and hospitalisation from COVID-19 infection. This increased fear among the people. This misleading data and reporting included, but is not limited to, 1. The repeated claim that the vaccines were safe and effective, without providing any information or evidence to support these claims which have since been proven to be both false and misleading. 2. The repeated claim that the vaccines were 95% effective, without explaining that this was a relative risk reduction figure. The figure that measures the expectation of population-wide effectiveness is the absolute risk reduction rate, which was in fact only around 1% effective, not 95%.
That specific New England Journal of Medicine paper, which underpinned the emergency use authorization of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, actually revealed an absolute risk reduction of 0.84%. 0.84%. In other words, for every 119 individuals vaccinated, one person would be protected from being infected.
Talk about the Pfizer vaccine, for example, that trial. It showed this 95% relative risk reduction in infection. Everyone took on board as thinking 95, if 100 people were exposed, 95 would be protected, which is not the case. It was 0.84% from infection. If we trust that data implicitly, which of course many people did, even though that data has never been released for independent analysis, which is something we're advocating for. But in addition to that, Mark, that trial didn't show any reduction in death rates from COVID, statistically significant death rates from COVID, or all-cause mortality. So everything we had to go on at the beginning was based upon that figure that was exaggerated in terms of its benefits.
3. The use of PCR tests to confirm positive COVID-19 cases in healthy people with no symptoms, a test that likely produced false positive test results in 97% or more cases. 4. Reporting of people who died with COVID instead of from COVID. This significantly overcounted the number of people who, in fact, died from COVID.
And what you see when you have case numbers at that level is that people, when they pass away from many other causes, they will die with COVID. And their deaths are recorded as COVID deaths. But that doesn't necessarily mean, as the premiers themselves have set out, that they passed away because of COVID. That's a very different proposition. And that's also the position of the Chief Medical Officer and the other health authorities.
5. The unusual practice of classifying people as unvaccinated until 2 weeks after a COVID-19 vaccine injection. This coerced healthy people to get vaccinated, as it exaggerated the number of unvaccinated people who died from or who were hospitalised with COVID-19. 6. Mainstream media failed to report important facts and research data which clearly show that the COVID-19 vaccines are not effective and, in fact, they have negative efficacy. These vaccines have been proven to weaken a person's natural immune system in direct proportion to the number of boosters injected.
What's truly astonishing is if you look at the Cleveland Clinic data, and I think people would recognize that Cleveland Clinic is a reputable organization. What they showed is that the more boosters you got, the greater the risk of getting COVID. So let me repeat that. I mean, it's a truly astonishing concept that you're vaccinating to prevent a disease, but in fact what's happening is because it's suppressing the immune system, it's increasing your risk of getting the disease you're trying to prevent. So we've spoken about it's not being safe. It's clearly not effective. And so they've lied to us.
Evidence shows that the double vaccinated are 27 times more likely to be infected with COVID-19, and those most likely to die from COVID-19 are in fact the triple vaccinated.
1,000 people in the study in Israel, just so you know, that showed that the double vax were 27 times more likely to get reinfected. So it's not, the vaccine, even if we just talk about that, is not stopping infection, it's not stopping transmission. If you look at the studies in England, in Scotland, and in northern countries in Europe where they get real data, that they're actually the triple vaccinated, the most likely to die.
A weakened immune system from the COVID-19 vaccines also leaves people more susceptible to all other diseases and illnesses. How could our premiers, chief ministers, chief medical and health officers, and other leaders continue to push the vaccines on all Australians after so much information about the harms of the vaccines became known? Mainstream media have broadcast numerous reports over recent years about ambulance ramping and overwhelmed hospital systems throughout Australia, but they have been largely silent on sharing this important research data about the negative efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, or questioning whether this could be the cause of our overwhelmed health systems. 7. Changes in early 2024 of the calculation of excess deaths by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Expected death rates have been reliably calculated by actuaries for decades. So if the total number of deaths for a period exceeds the expected deaths, these are called excess deaths. Excess death numbers have historically been calculated based on the average of the 5 prior years' figures, but the Australian Bureau of Statistics recently changed the basis of their calculation to include only the prior year. Every year following the COVID-19 vaccine rollout has shown increased absolute death numbers compared to 2019, but this change in calculation method by the ABS has now significantly lowered the number of excess deaths being reported each year. This clearly misrepresents and underreports the true number of excess deaths, that is, the true number of people who died unexpectedly since the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Our World in Data is arguably a more reliable source of this information, since they have not changed their calculation method from prior years. Due to this change in calculation of excess deaths by the ABS, analysis of deaths from all causes is an alternative source of meaningful data. Official data releases from the Australian Bureau of Statistics reveals that deaths from all causes rose dramatically from the end of 2021 and continued during 2022. Is it just a coincidence that this surge in deaths commenced after the bulk of the COVID vaccination program was completed by the end of 2021? Surely any reasonable person would agree that the timing of the vaccine rollout compared to the surge in deaths in Australia needs to be investigated. You may find it hard to believe that so much data and evidence from leading medical and scientific experts is available to support the claims of serious safety risks and negative efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. But the lack of reporting of this important information by the mainstream media is understandable when you learn of the existence of the Trusted News Initiative. The Trusted News Initiative is a group of global mainstream media organisations that agreed in 2019 to jointly control the information flow to the general public using coordinated messages. They choose what you will hear and they do not show you alternative explanations. This coordinated messaging across most major media outlets ensures that you will never hear the whole truth about any subject. It is censorship by another name. Mainstream media channels played an important role in creating the fear of a false global pandemic, and they pushed hard to have you accept the rollout of the experimental COVID-19 vaccines. They never showed alternative advice from many scientific and medical experts. Those views were censored. Significant evidence both in Australia and other countries indicates that the COVID-19 vaccine rollout was driven by a coordinated effort between politicians, including the Prime Minister, State Premiers and Chief Ministers, officers of federal and state departments of health and aged care, health regulators, including the Therapeutic Goods Administration, TGA, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, ATAGI, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, APRA, and the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, OGTR, and the mainstream media, including the national broadcaster, the ABC. The Prime Minister, State Premiers, Chief Ministers and Chief Medical and Health Officers used the mainstream media to hold daily announcements of infection rates. They described new cases as determined by PCR test results. But they never described whether these people were in fact sick or not sick. They also referred to deaths, both with or from the virus, without delineating if those deaths had occurred due to the virus or coincidental to the virus. These announcements appear to have been aimed at generating great fear in the public that there was a very serious disease circulating. The messages were clear, seemingly designed to scare the public into believing that this coronavirus could indiscriminately kill anyone, anywhere, at any time, regardless of their age or medical condition. The facts reveal that this was not true. The evidence clearly shows that COVID-19 was no more deadly than influenza, and that those most vulnerable to dying from COVID-19 were the same people that could die during a bad flu season. In fact, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the median age of death from COVID-19 is 85.7 years. The median age of death of an Australian is 82 years. And the median age of death from the flu in previous years was 76 years. So an Australian was, and still is, more likely to die from influenza or old age than from COVID-19. It is interesting to note that influenza mysteriously disappeared from official statistics in 2020 when COVID-19 arrived. This happened globally and in Australia, according to data from the World Health Organization, and it did not reappear in Australia until early 2022. After putting fear into people and continuing to push that fear every day for more than a year, the government actively banned doctors from using safe, effective, readily available drugs that could treat COVID-19 infections, such as ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. They also failed to promote safe, effective precautions, such as the use of vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, fresh air and sunshine to help people boost their immune systems. Many doctors around the world reported successfully treating tens of thousands of COVID-19 patients with a range of treatments that included ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, prednisone, antibiotics, antihistamines, and oxygen, with almost no hospitalisations or deaths.
Did we institute the correct treatments? A lot of people were killed because they weren't managed properly in ITU, in terms of putting people, intubating them, putting on respirators when they didn't need it, and that in itself has a risk. Some of the wrong treatments were given. There were other treatments now that we look back that probably would have been helpful, things like ivermectin, which I know has been a bit controversial, but it's very safer than paracetamol, right? So first do no harm, okay? But it may have done some good, and a lot of people and doctors around the world that used it in several thousand. There's a doctor in South Africa that used it in 14,000 patients, including many elderly. Not a single one died from COVID, and this is early on.
In Australia, those in power did not promote existing safe treatments and preventative measures. Instead, they coerced the entire population to take new experimental products with no long-term safety data, including experimental gene therapy bioweapons from AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. They falsely labelled all of these products as vaccines, and the Australian regulator, the TGA, granted access to these products under provisional approval pathways, which were much less stringent than the normal approval process, with significantly less safety data. The provisional approval pathway was never intended for granting access to experimental drugs to be used universally throughout the entire population, regardless of individual medical circumstances. And the pathway was never intended to impose experimental pharmaceutical products onto healthy people. The provisional approval pathway allows for temporary registration where the need for access to a drug outweighs the risks. This usually applies only to very sick patients with no prospect of survival. But our government leaders and regulators pushed these experimental vaccines onto the general public and never disclosed details of how they determined that the benefits of the experimental vaccines outweighed the risks. They also never disclosed whether the risk analysis changed for different age groups or was affected by pre-existing medical conditions. Criteria 3 of the eligibility criteria for provisional determination requires that no therapeutic goods that are intended to treat, prevent, or diagnose the condition are included in the register. So according to the TGA's own guidelines, the COVID-19 vaccines could not have been granted access for use in Australia when already listed products, such as ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, were available to treat COVID-19. Criteria 3 is an important criterion. Drugs that are not fully tested should not be granted access for use when other effective treatments with proven safety records are already available. However, the AstraZeneca, Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were nevertheless granted provisional approval in January and February 2021. This appears to be in breach of Criteria 3, as doctors around the world were reporting at the time that they were successfully treating their COVID-19 patients with products that were already listed in the TGA register. But then in July 2021, 5 months after provisional approval was granted for these 3 vaccines, the therapeutic goods regulations were altered. An amendment to the regulations removed the requirement for Criteria 3 to be addressed in applications for COVID-19 vaccines or treatments. Is this just a coincidence, or does this show intent to change the regulations to retrospectively justify the provisional approval that was granted for these 3 new vaccines 5 months earlier? It does appear that these products should never have been granted access under the original eligibility criteria that were in place at the time of the provisional approvals. Our state premiers, chief ministers, prime minister, chief medical and health officers, and other government and non-government health representatives and media personalities saturated the media with calls to take the experimental vaccines. They gave constant assurances that these vaccines were safe and effective.
This is our shot.
Our shot.
Our shot. This is our shot.
I've had my shot.
This is my shot.
This is my shot.
This is my shot. Come on, Australia, let's get the job done. Start a conversation with your doctor about your shot.
Clearly, the government's own data was showing an alarming number of deaths and injuries being reported by doctors via the government's Adverse Events Reporting Database, DAEN. This included reports of 9 children who died, but these reports were never disclosed to the public to warn parents of potential risks of the vaccines. Due to the power held by all people involved, they had the means to push a narrative of fear and to coerce the public into taking the experimental vaccines. This coercion continued in spite of significant protests from millions of Australians that they did not want to take a largely untested new drug. In fact, many of those who protested or raised concerns were silenced, smeared, and arrested. Many lost their jobs and were labelled by those same people in power as anti-vaxxers or other derogatory terms. This seems to have been a further strategy to coerce people to toe the line on the government's narrative that the vaccines were safe and effective and that everyone needed to be injected to protect the vulnerable. Government bureaucrats and their enforcement agencies stripped doctors of their long-held and proven medical ethical practices of first do no harm, ensuring that all patients were given fully informed, voluntary and valid consent for any medical product. The privacy of medical records was abused, as was the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. Normally, doctors must ensure that their patients are not being coerced to take any medical procedures or treatments in order for their informed consent to be legally valid. But this requirement was ignored as coercion was common, due to the mandates and other restrictive measures imposed on the population, under threat that certain vaccination targets needed to be met before people could resume their normal lives. But coercion invalidates consent. We asked police detectives to investigate why state guides to informed decisions and consent were ignored in respect of the COVID-19 injections. Why was there such a serious departure from these reasonable standards of conduct and care? Due to the resistance and protests of millions of Australians, most of which the mainstream media failed to report, those in power then used their power to unlawfully mandate the experimental vaccines. These mandates did not only apply to public sector workers such as health professionals, police officers, firefighters, teachers and other public servants, it was also adopted by many large corporations, many of which rely on revenue from government contracts. Many corporations, businesses and unions quickly fell into line with vaccine mandates for employees, without providing details of the risk versus benefit analysis of these experimental products. This important analysis was never provided by those insisting that the vaccines were safe and effective.
Another really important insight from the report, one of the most important insights I think, is the lack of a shift through the course of the pandemic between a very understandable approach based on the precautionary principle at the outset. Lock everything down, take a precautionary approach while we start to understand the scale of the challenge. The lack of a shift from that position in the early months to a position that was more evidence-based, that balanced risks and benefits, took account of non-health impacts of decisions being imposed on the community by governments, by leaders, and did so in a proportionate way. That is a really compelling insight from this report.
The former Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, candid on Victoria's approach.
Do you think you failed to explain sometimes?
Of course I did. Of course I did.
A federal report revealed a lack of clear, honest communication was one of the most harmful aspects of the pandemic. The expert at the time admits,
I think evidence changes all the time, and I think sometimes it just wasn't there. And so, of course, sometimes you're making a best guess.
The mainstream media received millions of advertising dollars from the government to promote the vaccine narrative and ensure that those who raised concerns about the experimental vaccines were quickly shut down. Many people who did not comply with the unethical and unlawful directions and mandates, and consequently lost their jobs, were some of Australia's leading non-government doctors and scientists who raised the alarm, the very people that the government should have been taking advice from. These experts, which included many frontline doctors, had a moral and ethical duty to speak out when they saw public health messages and practices that could harm people. But instead of listening to these experts, the authorities set out systematically to take down, silence, discredit, deregister, and remove academic titles of anyone who questioned the safe and effective narrative in any way.
They're afraid to write exemptions for people who are injured by the vaccine. So that's the culture of fear that is out there.
Ethical politicians who did their research and tried to present the facts and the science to protect the people were also smeared, ostracised, and even threatened.
I've been very disappointed about the Labor Party making this a partisan issue and attacking me and smearing me and slandering me and actually misrepresenting what I say. Australia's most senior immunologist, Emeritus Professor Robert Clancy, someone that was actually awarded an Order of Australia for his services to immunology and medicine. He has said, and I quote, Craig Kelly is absolutely right. Now, that's our most senior immunologist. So the idea that I completely and utterly reject the idea that I'm out there putting any theories forward. I'm not putting any theories forward at all. Right? Now, people have been misrepresenting my position, and that's why I'm happy to come on and defend it, because a lot of things that are being said are completely untrue. Mm-hmm.
All our hopes are riding on a vaccine.
Yes.
You need to be quiet.
Well, if you don't want to listen to our most senior qualified
I am
immunologists
listening
in
to
this
them,
country,
and I think you need to start listening to our scientists and our doctors, Craig.
Our scientist is our most senior qualified immunologist in this country,
Okay,
Professor
Craig.
Robert Clancy, and you are not listening to him.
I served for something like 11 years as an Australian federal member of parliament. I was one of those politicians who wasn't afraid of sticking his head above the parapets on many different issues, and when you do that, you tend to get some pot shots. But I'd never experienced anything as ferocious as what come to me when I started speaking up about COVID-19. Senator Roberts organised a number of different parliamentarians, politicians from all different parties to come together and have this informal inquiry into COVID-19. And during that inquiry, I was talking in camera, that is in confidence, with these people who showed some slides, and they showed things that they saw under a microscope. And I was alarmed. I was alarmed when I heard what they had said, when they showed the footage. And I said to them, I need to come and see this for myself. And so they took me. These people took me to their laboratory. And so these weren't just everyday Joes. These people were involved in the health industry. One of the people that was there vouching for them was a pathologist herself. And when we went into their laboratory, they took me through the whole chain of custody. There was nothing that happened that was untoward. So these people took me to a fridge where they extracted a vial of a certain substance that I can't name on social media, and that tells you as much as you need to know about the powers that be and what's going on here. But anyway, they put a needle inside this vial. All of this happened right in front of me, by the way. They extracted the substance out of this vial. They'd gotten the substance from a doctor who, again, didn't want his name mentioned, didn't want any identification happening to him. And that, again, tells a very big story. But they extracted this substance from this vial. And then they went and proceeded to go to a dark field microscope where they put this vial, the substance in this vial, on a slide. And then I was shown what was in this substance. These people went and proceeded to show me slides of blood from people that had the substance injected into them. And it was shortly after this, when I was telling a few trusted people, that someone said to me, "You need to shut up about this, because if what you saw is right and you have this information now and you can bring it to light, you might end up dead before you do it. Your family might end up dead. Be very careful." I got to tell you, I was incredibly frightened, more than I ever have been before, because of this information.
State premiers and chief ministers around the country regularly appeared in the media telling people that if they did not take these vaccines, they would be excluded from society.
If you are anti-mandate, you are absolutely anti-vax. I don't care what your personal vaccination status is.
I want to be very clear. Life for the unvaccinated will be very difficult indefinitely.
If you are unvaccinated and the virus comes into your community, the virus will hunt you out.
And just confirms that this really is a pandemic now of the unvaccinated. Life will become very difficult for the unvaccinated from January 31.
Some presidents of the AMA did the same. The lives and livelihoods of millions of Australians were damaged by these products labelled as vaccines and the other draconian pandemic measures enforced by the government under the false guise of protecting the people from this dangerous virus. Interestingly though, politicians and federal employees did not have to risk their livelihoods or right to participate in society, as they were exempted from the mandates. If this virus was so dangerous, why would our politicians and federal employees be exempted from taking a supposedly life-saving vaccine?
I understand Commonwealth employees and court staff are exempt from the mandate.
Oh yeah, that's not a watering down. That's specific advice, legal advice, and supported by the Solicitor General, that there are constitutional and other legal protections for some of those groups that mean that a mandate was really not a recommendation for those groups.
And will that apply to MPs too? I mean, are those of state MPs in the parliament?
Yeah, I believe so. Again, legal impediments or legal recommendations that MPs can't be within those mandates.
The outcome of these actions was that millions of Australians took a product that they were assured repeatedly was safe and effective, which has now been proven to be neither safe nor effective. They were coerced to do so under threat of losing their jobs or being excluded from society. Unvaccinated Australians were even prevented from being with sick and dying loved ones and elderly relatives in nursing homes. These unlawful restrictions on people's human rights were unnecessarily cruel. This is arguably a form of state-mandated terrorism and was certainly a gross breach of people's human rights. A major legal case is already underway in Queensland courts to prosecute the human rights abuses. Many actions by those in power were also quite clearly a case of fraudulent misrepresentation committed by all Australian governments against the Australian people. The Supreme Court in Queensland confirmed that the vaccine mandates were unlawful.
When the decision was read out in court, they cried and cheered. Police men and women, paramedics and staff from QPS and QAS. They refused to get vaccinated during the COVID pandemic and launched a landmark legal challenge. The case was heard in 2022 when the mandates were still in force. Today, 18 months on, Justice Glenn Martin found directions by the Police Commissioner in September and December 2021 were unlawful under Section 58 of the Human Rights Act. While for QAS, the Director General's direction was found to have no effect.
The mandates and coercion were also in breach of the Nuremberg Code, and they breached other international agreements on human rights, including the all-important Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris in 1948. More than 200 police officers and staff and Queensland Ambulance Service officers have launched a class action against the state of Queensland, claiming COVID-19 mandatory vaccination directions were coercive and devastating. Lawyers representing the class action say the claim seeks to remedy the many wrongs that came from the unlawful mandates, claiming misfeasance in public office, negligence, and breach of statutory duty. Many other civil actions are also underway in the courts. One involves over 2,000 victims under a class action legal case to seek remedy for COVID-19 vaccine injuries and deaths. We ask the police to investigate the many serious departures from reasonable standards of care and conduct by those who had a duty of care to the Australian public. We allege that their failure to perform their duty to use reasonable care to avoid danger to life, safety or health has caused death and injury to potentially millions of Australians. We also ask you to investigate whether there was foreseeability of potential harm and/or intent to commit the alleged crimes. Government leaders and regulators failed to promote safe, effective precautions against COVID-19, and they actively restricted the use of TGA-approved safe medicines such as Nobel Prize-winning ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which numerous doctors both in Australia and globally reported as being effective in treating COVID-19. Is this evidence of intent? Our government leaders changed the therapeutic goods regulations in July 2021 to allow access to experimental vaccines that did not meet the full criteria of the provisional approval pathway. Is this evidence of intent? Those pushing mandates and restrictions must or should have known that they were breaking laws in mandating the COVID-19 vaccines and restricting people's freedoms and livelihoods to coerce them to comply. Is this evidence of intent? Numerous public announcements by state premiers, chief ministers, and chief medical and health officers stated their clear goals to reach certain vaccination targets before they would lift social restrictions. Was the harm caused a foreseeable consequence of these actions? Is this evidence of intent? Even though serious adverse events and deaths from the vaccines were being reported regularly by thousands of people, the push continues to this day to promote these products and encourage and coerce people to take further injections. Was the harm caused a foreseeable consequence of these actions? Is this evidence of intent? Tens of thousands of experts globally have publicly shared abundant evidence of the risks and harms of the COVID-19 injections. They have called for these injections to be stopped and the products withdrawn. Yet our leaders continue to ignore these calls. Was the harm caused a foreseeable consequence of these inactions? Is this evidence of intent? The most recent call in Australia to stop the COVID-19 injections is from MP Russell Broadbent in his letters to the Prime Minister, co-signed by over 50 world-leading doctors, professors, scientists and legal experts. But even this call has to this day, on the 1st of January 2025, been ignored by the PM and our state, territory and federal leaders. Denials from the Therapeutic Goods Administration regarding the findings of Dr. Speaker have been met with widespread condemnation, ridicule and anger from many of the world's leading scientists. Was the harm caused a foreseeable consequence of these actions and inactions? Is this evidence of intent? It appears that many crimes may have been committed by numerous people in positions of power and influence who had a duty to protect us. We allege that these crimes have resulted in death and injury to many Australians. It is clear that the alleged perpetrators had the means through their collective positions of power, reputation and authority to commit these crimes. We allege that they also had the intent to commit these crimes, as the harm caused must have been a foreseeable consequence of their actions or inactions. There is and was a significant amount of data and evidence available in the public domain that enabled them to predict that their conduct would result in harm to the Australian people. We ask Australian police detectives to investigate these allegations without fear or favour. In addition to this witness statement, we can also provide an evidence dossier in relation to the alleged crimes, with facts supported by scientific publications. Please review the facts presented very carefully to understand them, because what they reveal in totality is that the government's response to the pandemic was not the result of managing a serious threat to the lives of Australians. There was no pandemic of death in Australia. We had effective treatments for COVID-19. People were coerced to take vaccines that they did not need and which were not safe, nor did they prevent infection or transmission of the virus. The injections labelled COVID-19 vaccines, which the Australian people were coerced to take without their legally valid, informed consent, have caused injury and death to potentially millions of Australians. Many of Australia's best doctors, scientists, legal minds, human rights lawyers, and other concerned Australians tried desperately to expose these facts since the outset of the pandemic, but they were silenced, ignored, and in many cases prevented by regulatory bodies from practicing their professions simply because they brought this hard evidence to the attention of those in power. Perhaps some of the alleged offenders truly did believe at the outset that there was a dangerous pandemic and that the mislabelled vaccines were the only way to protect the people. But they must have been aware of the significant data and information which began to appear in the public domain. This includes calls from tens of thousands of doctors around the world raising the alarm of the serious potential side effects and deaths from these products. The fact that those in power did not act on this information points to a coordinated cover-up of these alleged crimes, crimes which continue today with ongoing calls for people to get further boosters of the COVID-19 vaccines. The facts and data available make it very clear that those in positions of power and authority were not just doing the best that they could in uncertain times. They must have known that their actions or inactions would cause harm to the Australian people. Unbiased, evidence-based reports from multiple independent sources showed scientific facts and real-world data that was certain from the outset, but it was ignored and/or covered up by those in power. Health Minister Mark Butler admitted that the Commonwealth COVID-19 response inquiry revealed that the government did not use an evidence-based response to the pandemic. It is simply inexplicable as to why our leaders and regulators did not seek and assess all available evidence before making decisions that had such significant impacts on the health, well-being and livelihoods of every Australian.
The inquiry report points to a lack of transparency around the rationale and the evidence behind decisions that were taken by governments that had such a profound impact on the lives of Australians and the freedom of Australians. The points I've already made about the lack of real-time evidence-based policy and the lack of transparency has driven a large decline in trust, which the panel members say, and these are their words, means that many of the measures taken during COVID-19 are unlikely to be accepted by the population again.
Much of the scientific information and real-world data was even exposed in Parliament and Senate estimates and inquiries by those ethical politicians who took the time to investigate the science and the facts. This cover-up, ignoring of the facts, or by the government's own admission, failure to implement evidence-based responses is clear evidence of intent to continue to cause harm to the Australian people. Evidence of this harm is clearly visible in the increased numbers of deaths from all causes in Australia and the COVID-19 vaccine injuries being suffered by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Australian people. We are aware that many people who are now hearing of the significant harms caused by the vaccines say the benefits of the vaccines outweigh the risks, often saying that millions of lives were saved. But it must be pointed out that there is absolutely no evidence that these experimental products saved any lives at all. As the official data shows, the number of COVID-19 deaths was approximately equal to the number of flu deaths in prior years, and in 2020, the year that COVID-19 first appeared, the year before the vaccine rollout, there was no increase in deaths from all causes in Australia. Deaths in Australia surged in the last quarter of 2021, following a surge in COVID-19 vaccinations in the second half of 2021. So where is the evidence that the vaccine saved any lives? The deaths from all causes data reveals exactly the opposite effect of the vaccines. The epidemiology modelling of Neil Ferguson and the Imperial College London played a preeminent role in shutting down most of the world. This mathematical modelling predicted catastrophic death tolls from COVID-19 back in March 2020, but these models proved to include highly exaggerated forecasts, as clearly evidenced by data from Sweden, a country that did not shut down or follow the strategies recommended by Ferguson. The argument that the vaccine saved lives arises solely from such theoretical mathematical models based on hypothetical projections, as well as false positive PCR test results, which grossly overestimated the number of potential or expected COVID-19 deaths. Then when those deaths did not occur, they claimed it was due to the vaccines. But those deaths did not occur in 2020, before the vaccines arrived. So where is the evidence of any benefits of the vaccines at all, let alone lives having been saved? Remember, in the original Pfizer trial, more people died in the vaccinated group than the placebo group, so even the Pfizer study results did not show any lives being saved.
There was a paper not so long ago that made news headlines that the vaccine has saved 20 million lives globally, right? And that was a modelling, I mean, it's the lowest quality level of evidence, extrapolations from a modelling study, right? It's science fiction, it's marketing, it's fraud.
We wish to reiterate that all facts and evidence presented in this witness statement can be very easily verified. These are not theories. The weight of evidence that this was a coordinated effort to get new experimental untested products, including gene therapy bioweapons, injected into almost every Australian, is very clear when you consider all of these facts combined and the positions of power held by all of those involved in pushing the vaccine agenda. The intent to harm is further evidenced by the fact that in spite of potentially hundreds of thousands of injured Australians and tens of thousands of dead Australians, the government is still refusing to stop the shots and properly investigate the dangers and risks of the COVID-19 vaccines and the cause of the excess deaths.
Joining us now to discuss the COVID pandemic. We haven't talked about that for a while, so let's get stuck into it with Angus Dalgleish, the Emeritus Professor of Oncology at the University of London and Principal of the Institute of Cancer Vaccines and Immunotherapy. Angus, great to have you on. Already your title is making me nervous. Tell me, there's so many things, and you're an expert on this, so many things that Australia did wrong around COVID, from lockdowns and mask mandates to vaccine mandates. What for you now, with hindsight, the benefit of hindsight admittedly, what is the single worst thing Australian governments inflicted on the Australian people during COVID?
Well, the first thing I would say was the lockdown. There was absolutely no need for this, and I think it was universally agreed by everybody who's looked at this. And this seems to have been a controlled initiative, like around the world. Everybody did it except Sweden. Now, my God, I really admire Angus Tagnall, the chief medical officer there, who said, no, we're not doing it. It will cause far more harm than anything else. But I think we're here today to discuss the dreadful use of vaccines and the mandates that have caused so much problem. And it's very clear now that why on earth did they do this? I mean, I have no idea, because from the very beginning, these vaccines were not vaccines, particularly the ones that ended up after AstraZeneca with all the clots and they were shut down. But the messenger RNA vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna have caused unbelievable problems and damage to people, and I don't think we will ever really be able to get over that. I mean, the whole concept I challenged from day one. I said, right from the beginning, this virus escaped from the laboratory. It has 6 inserts that could only have been put in manually. My peers said, well, this can occur randomly. I said, no, once, but not 6 times. This has been interfered with. And the most important thing, we said that the vaccine was 80% homologous to humans, so it was bound to cause major side effects. Now, why did everybody go along with it? I mean, we informed everybody, the government, through the Five Eyes process, that this would happen, but everybody ignored it. So why did this happen? And now we know that it's even worse than that the vaccines the quality control was appalling. They changed the mechanism of manufacture between the trial and the rollout to about 6 billion people. This thing was full of contaminants. It was full of sequences that can actually get into your genome. And my big concern is that a lot of them explain why that a couple of years into this epidemic, we still have massive excess deaths. Excess deaths in Australia, New Zealand, and everywhere. And a lot of these now are due to cancer. And that's basically what I want to discuss here. The red flags are so enormous. Why has the government not banned these vaccines immediately? For a start, COVID doesn't exist anymore. And if it does, it doesn't kill anybody anymore. So why are you using vaccines, boosters that we now know increase the rate of cancer, and the cancers are appalling, they're turbo cancers. No child died of COVID unless they had some underlying condition like leukemia. It was absolutely abhorrent that they would even think of this, and they were pushed into this by Pfizer and all the people that Pfizer and Moderna wanted to get this into absolutely everybody. These were not vaccines. These were horrible gene therapies that could actually integrate into your genome. And this is one of the reasons we're seeing this horrendous rise in turbo cancers. I'm terrified what they have done to our children. I think everybody who went along to that should actually stand up to trial, defend themselves and go to court. This is unbelievable, the incompetence, medical negligence, everything, and nobody is accepting responsibility for this. It is unbelievable case of cognitive dissonance, and I hold everybody to account. I hold the chief medical officers to account, the chief scientific officers to account. I cannot believe the MHRA and the TGA and the FDA, the level of incompetence and negligence, and they have to be held. This is Nuremberg trial stuff. They are so awful. Now, we know about the contamination. Your TGA have stood up and said, oh, we've done this little study, that study, what have you, but it doesn't really matter because they're safe and effective. They started with the mandate that these vaccines were safe and effective. No, they were never, ever effective. I've looked at the first submissions of Pfizer to the FDA. There was no evidence that they were effective whatsoever. It was basically hope. And they were never, ever safe. The first mandate, the first submission of Pfizer showed that they caused every single side effect you could ever possibly want, and yet the FDA still approved them, and the TGA and the MHRA went along with it. This was absolute criminal negligence. Their job was to say, are they safe? Are they effective? No, they were not. And yet they signed off on it.
Why do you think so many nations like Australia all went in with this, in the wake of this pandemic that we know was caused by a virus that was done in a lab, that was doing research that was paid for by the US to get around its own restrictions?
Well, I totally agree. As I said, my colleagues and I were the first to point out that this escaped from the lab. There was no other explanation. There was 6 positive charges in this virus. 2 of them had been previously published out of the Wuhan in Western medical literature. So why did they cover up? Why did they do the lockdown? Why did they do the mandate? I'm sorry that I couldn't believe that my peers in humanity would descend to such lows. This basically, the whole thing was planned. The whole lockdown was an experiment in control. And there was this Manhattan Project in its Department of Defense. They were doing this genetic engineering, which Obama quite rightly said should never have been done. It's a gain of function. Fauci was told not to do it. So what did he do? He got it done elsewhere, including the Wuhan laboratory in China. And he lied, I believe. Rand Paul's held him up on this. And the greatest thing that's happened is that Robert F. Kennedy has written the most brilliant book on how evil Fauci is, the real Anthony Fauci.
Well,
if he gets into power in January, this whole thing, I believe, will be over. He will basically hold them all to account for this, because I believe this is the greatest crime of the century.
Any police officer in Australia with any conscience or good ethics must surely see, based on the evidence presented, that these alleged crimes need to be investigated and these vaccines stopped. And this needs to be done quickly before any more people die or become injured. In addition to this witness statement, we can provide further evidence of the alleged crimes and details of expert witnesses who are available and willing to provide further information and testify in court if required. We understand the enormous reach and complexity of the alleged crimes, which may be difficult to investigate, requiring medical and scientific expertise and significant resources. Accordingly, we can also provide an outline of the issues that we believe need to be investigated, some key questions that need to be asked, and information that needs to be requested in order to prove the motives behind the alleged crimes and to prosecute the offenders. Please consider carefully the calls of tens of thousands of doctors, scientists, lawyers, and expert witnesses from both Australia and around the world who have been shouting out since 2021 that these shots must be stopped. They warn us that these products labelled as vaccines are dangerous. They are killing people, they are injuring people, they are causing heart attacks, sudden deaths and turbo cancers, they are causing miscarriages and stillbirths, they are impacting the fertility of future generations, and they are also potentially changing our human genes.
The objective of these so-called gene-based vaccines was to inject you with a genetic sequence for something called spike protein. Now, it doesn't really matter what spike protein is, if it's real, where it came from. The point is, it's a genetic sequence for a protein that doesn't belong in your body. It's non-self, it's foreign. Your immune system is a wonderful work of God and nature. It distinguishes self, things that are meant to be inside you and are fine, from anything else, foreign, non-self. If you inject a person with a genetic sequence that instructs your body to become a factory for some protein that doesn't belong in you, your immune system will detect that and it will attack every cell that's done that instruction and kill it. Now, these materials, when injected in your arm, didn't stay in your arm. They traveled around your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your brain, your ovaries. And in every place it landed, if it was taken up and expressed, your body registered that as foreign invasion, and it attacked and killed every cell doing it. But proteins like the one they claim was encoded in these gene-based materials are known to be toxic. There are loads of experiments, lots of published experiments, showing that proteins like that one cause blood coagulation, damaged nerves, damaged heart tissue.
As a doctor, I have never seen something so injurious to the human body. It invades the brain. It invades the heart. It causes brain and heart damage. It invades the bone marrow. It stimulates antibodies to actually start to attack our own platelets and our other cells in our body. It causes blood clotting and damage to blood vessels like we've never seen. Data from University of Pittsburgh suggesting it causes cancer. Since when do we have a protein that actually injures the brain, injures the heart, the bone marrow, the immune system, causes blood clotting, and potentially causes cancer in a single protein? It's a weapon. In fact, there are 3 papers, one by Farkas, published in Military Medicine, and 2 by Yen, published in preprint. They've actually concluded it is a bioweapon. It is a bioweapon. According to strict military criteria, it's a bioweapon.
We cannot emphasise enough the serious impacts of the alleged crimes. You only have to turn on the TV, and almost every night on the 6 o'clock news, there are reports that our hospitals and ambulance services are totally overwhelmed. For over 4 years, many good doctors in Australia, including well-respected specialists, have been speaking out to warn of the risks and side effects of the COVID-19 vaccines. But their pleas for evidence-based science to prevail were ignored. Instead, they were silenced by the federal medical regulator, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, APRA. Threatening letters were sent, and medical practices were raided with patient files confiscated.
The medical regulator is investigating his conduct, but his patients say he's innocent.
Dr. Mark Hobart has been forced to abandon his Sunshine North clinic, but his patients refuse to abandon him. He has been suspended from practicing medicine anywhere in Australia. The health department raiding his office yesterday.
They seized my confidential patient files and my appointment book.
A doctor in the inner west for more than 30 years, the investigation has left patients in the lurch.
Now I've got issues. I need certificates. I can't get my hands on my files.
Some doctors were even suspended from practice and had to appear before APRA committees.
On Friday, I was thrilled to learn that in the Queensland Supreme Court, a very brave doctor, Dr. William Bay, who again spoke his mind right at the beginning, as we did repeatedly every week on this show, against the madness of the lockdowns and the mandates and all of that rubbish. Dr. William Bay was suspended for that, but the Supreme Court of Queensland stepped in and overturned that suspension on Friday, and I'm delighted to say Dr. William Bay joins us now.
The Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency and the Medical Board of Australia did a criminal thing in March of 2021 and issued a gag order to all nurses, doctors, psychologists and every other health practitioner in Australia to shut up and be quiet about the risks of the COVID so-called vaccines. So when a medical regulator with all the force and the might and the power of a large corporate entity in the government comes at you and threatens your career, threatens all the years of studying, your family, your career, your money, like they did me, and take it all away from you in just a moment for speaking out, I can understand why so many doctors and nurses were silent during this pandemic. That does not necessarily excuse the doctors and the nurses who stood quiet, because there is a responsibility to patients. There is a responsibility to protect them from harm and to tell the truth. This was a criminal act by AHPRA, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, and the head of the Medical Board, because they denied Australians the right to choose freely, thus being responsible for the injury and deaths of thousands of people in Australia. Deaths and injuries that could not be revealed by your local general practitioner or your cardiologist or your surgeon, because we were prohibited by the medical regulator from speaking the truth. This is outrageous, and I'm so happy that the Supreme Court of Queensland has ruled that I had the legal right from day one to speak out against the vaccines. I did the right thing. I never broke the code of conduct, and now freedom of speech and informed consent has been vindicated.
The censorship, coercion, false reporting, cover-ups, deaths and injuries will not stop until these alleged crimes are acknowledged, the perpetrators are brought to justice, the vaccines are stopped, and the doctors are free to openly speak without censorship about what they have discovered and what treatments they have found to help people who are suffering the side effects of these dangerous gene therapy bioweapons. There is overwhelming evidence that many crimes have been committed against the people of Australia. Now that we have formally reported these crimes, if the police do not act to investigate and pursue prosecutions, you will also join the perpetrators covering up the alleged crimes, and you will also be brought to justice in the future in courts of law. Again, we ask, if the Australian police will not protect the Australian people, investigate these allegations, and bring the perpetrators to justice, who will? Who will protect us? If you do not investigate these alleged offences, you will see more people dying, more people getting sick around you, and more vaccine-injured people suffering because the doctors do not know how to treat them. The doctors are not being permitted to even admit that their patients are vaccine-injured, let alone share and discuss possible treatments. If you do not investigate these alleged crimes, the people around you and future generations will suffer and continue to suffer the side effects of these seriously dangerous gene therapy bioweapons labelled as vaccines. Please do not wait until one of your loved ones dies suddenly, or is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, or develops some other unexplainable serious illness before you act. Please do not ignore our crime reports. Please start investigating these reported crimes now.
That's one of the reasons why we've been so gaslit about COVID vaccine injuries and the myocarditis and the heart attacks and the autoimmune diseases, the neurological diseases, and the turbo cancers. I think doctors are afraid of being sued. They're afraid that once their patients realize what's been done to them, that they received an experimental product that was toxic, that was contaminated. We know that every single COVID vaccine was contaminated with DNA fragments, DNA plasmids. These had, high risk of integration into our DNA, high risk of knocking out tumor suppressor genes, for example, and causing aggressive cancers that we're seeing, an absolute tsunami of aggressive cancers now. The doctors are gaslighting their patients now, telling them, well, it's long COVID or it's something else, it's your diet or what have you. We see these stories all the time where they're trying to blame everything but the vaccine. And there was so much pressure to basically cover things up, cover up the injuries, sweep them under the rug, make them go away, pretend they don't exist. Ultimately, I think people will have to come after every single doctor, every single nurse, every single health professional who was involved in these crimes. And these are crimes. This is not hyperbole. This is not being inflammatory. Like, these are actual crimes. People were killed. People died in hospitals because of medical malpractice. And I think people have to be held accountable. We cannot move on as a society with zero accountability when thousands of patients died at the hands of the medical system.
We leave you with some of the faces of the many who have died or been injured by the dangerous injections that they did not need and which we believe should never have been approved for use by the TGA. These people's lives and the lives of their families and friends have been destroyed forever. Please do your duty to investigate these alleged crimes without fear or favour, so that justice may be served for these innocent victims and hundreds of thousands more people just like them all across Australia. Thank you.
This has been going on for like 2.5 years. And so basically what we see on the ground is clearly not being reported. So it's a lot of sudden, a lot of turbo cancers, a lot. And then there's mainly heart disease. And then there's a lot of other things that sort of go down from that as well.
What is it about this that makes you go, this isn't normal? Who are these people?
It's a lot of people that are young and healthy and are just dropping dead. They just drop dead. And you're just hearing it all the time in funeral services. And this is something that you didn't hear 5 years ago. You didn't hear 10 years ago. It is completely different thing. It's all you're hearing. And it's also when you're on the ground talking to cemetery staff, these people that are sort of noticing a difference who are commenting but aren't connecting the dots. And they're just saying, I'll just say things to you like, we used to do a baby funeral once a month. Now we're doing 4 a week. So there's just that massive difference in numbers. What I experienced the other day, firsthand, for the first time, I was standing in a mortuary. There was a dear soul on the mortuary table having a form of embalming. And this gentleman that was doing this work I've known for close to 15 years. And he looked at me and he said, I have never seen so many blood clots. I have never seen so many blood clots. And I went, there you go. There's my first one, firsthand. I was looking at the dear soul. And he said to me, as he was trying to push the embalming fluid through her arm, he said, I was just pushing the clots up like that, one after the other. And I said, and how many other people do you have like this? Like, how many other people? And he goes, oh, there's a lot. The one thing he did say to me was the longest one he's put out is 2 feet. It was 2 foot long. I work with, particular people in hospitals, and they have said to me, I've never seen so many babies. There's different areas, especially the coroners, that would be seeing so much stuff, but no one says anything.
Without immediate action, we risk leaving Australians vulnerable to a wave of preventable diseases that may devastate families and strain our healthcare system. These gene-based vaccines should never have been considered. The technology had never been proven to be effective in preventing coronavirus infections. The technology had been shown to be unsafe long before it was used in 2021.
But the people are waking. We know and we knew that this is all bullshit and that we've been had. But we are going to hound you down, the people that are guilty. We are going to hound you down and hold you accountable. and we will expose your global agenda so that the people of Australia can be free in the future. Because I love my kids and I'm looking forward to my grandkids. And we are going to save this country.
COVID-19 vaccine injuries have taken a toll on thousands of Australians and their families. And many are still suffering and struggling with the impacts. It's clear from the comments online that there's a growing groundswell of vaccine-injured Australians that are rightly fed up with being ignored and abandoned. Australians trusted the government to protect them with a so-called safe and effective vaccine and help them if anything went wrong. But that's not what's happening. That is not what's happening. Vaccine-injured Australians deserve better. That's justice as I see it.
I traveled across the nation to sing for our freedom. I arrived in Coffs Harbour. No time for vacation. When I walked into the festival, I saw a sight I'd never seen before. A sea of signs waving in the breeze. What was written there, I had to see. This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen, you will see and you will grieve. Every picture told a story of death and injury from our so-called vaccinations, mandated throughout our nation. There were people moving slowly in the forest of the fallen. I was singing right beside it, could not stop my tears from rolling. This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen, you will see and you will grieve. The silence, it was deafening. The signs were so shocking. Do you know how many neighbors will never work again, never live again? This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen, you will see and you will grieve, lest we forget, 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 lest we